Welcome back to the David Curtin Show. I'm David Curtin here on today's News Talk TNT. Now, I have a fantastic guest with me on the show today. This is Dr. Claire Craig, who is one of the joint co-chairman or chair people of HEART, the HEART Advisory Group, who were so good in speaking for truth in the whole COVID lockdown injection period, and even now coming into what the powers that be are seeking to do as we go on. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you ever so much for having me on, David.
Oh, great to have you on. You were a voice, you were a light in the darkness, along with all your fellows there in Heart Gym for over the last 4 years. And we were abused, I think, by the government, by the powers that be, by behavioral psychologists, and all these top civil servants that put in place the lockdowns and the injections and tried to force us to have these things. But when did you realize that there was something very, very wrong, and what the government was saying, that the official line that we were getting was wrong, and that you needed to stand up against it?
So, to be honest, there's some people that can say that they knew you from the beginning. There were people
Mm.
that did know from the beginning, but I really wasn't one of them. I
Oh.
fell for it, and I was scared. I was scared by them. And when I wasn't scared about myself anymore, I was still
Mm.
scared about the NHS collapsing or about the
Mm.
old people in my life that I loved.
Mm.
And so it took me until the summer of 2020 really before I started to see that in my own area of expertise, which was the testing, things really weren't right.
Mm.
And I could dig into the data and show that to be the case. And then when I published on that, I was viciously attacked. And so obviously that then completely changed my outlook on the
Mm.
whole thing, because I was expecting one of two simple scenarios: either you're wrong, here's why, or oh yeah, we haven't thought of that, let's do something about it. And
Mm.
that, I thought that would be it. So when I was then attacked and then met
Mm.
a lot of people who had their own concerns from their area of expertise, then that whole sort of world opened out to me after that.
Yeah, I mean, this is how science has been totally destroyed in a way. That the whole scientific method that we've had since Rene Descartes has developed that is universally accepted. That you present a thesis and an idea, then you test it, you do observations, you make measurements, and then you can see whether what you've theorized is correct or not, and then you expect some intelligent response, like, okay, no, that doesn't work, it's wrong, or oh, that does work, that's correct. Let's amend what we do because of that. But that's gone out of the window now. And as you say, you were just attacked and smeared because of what you said about testing. And to me, the whole idea of testing people that don't have symptoms and then adding them to the figures was completely ridiculous, wasn't it?
And there was all sorts about the testing that was ridiculous. I could go on for hours about the testing. But
Yeah.
I think what you've touched on there, which is really important, is that science and politics have got so many opposites. In
Mm.
science, we're living in a world of uncertainty. Like that's where we live. We are present in a world of uncertainty,
Mm.
and where, as you brilliantly described, what we're always trying to do is show what's wrong. We're always
Mm.
out to prove ourselves wrong so that we can learn and move and change. And in that world where you've got uncertainty and nuance, you can have civilized debates with people who've got a different view to you, and just like try and
Mm.
figure out how we're going to figure out where the truth lies, because that's actually what the quest is for everybody, no matter what
Yeah.
your view is. But in politics, of course, politics is a world of certainty where you can't risk being wrong, and where nuance is all a bit awkward, really. And so, they couldn't be more opposite. And so, what was presented as science has been politics the whole way through.
Yeah, I noticed that. The thing is, I'm coming from a unique position in a way because I've got a background in science. I've got a degree in chemistry, and I was a science teacher for many years before I got into politics, and now I'm in politics. But I can see, what people do in politics is you have to get everything out in a very short sound bite, and then people are trying to destroy you if you say something that, is vaguely contentious or even nuanced. And really then you get alarmism and catastrophism builds up. And this is what is presented to the public in propaganda terms, which is what we needed. And then it went on. And the really terrible thing then is even if lockdowns weren't bad enough, then we got these experimental injections, as I call them, rolled out, and we were all told you have to have these to come out of lockdowns, and then if you don't have them, you are responsible for us staying in lockdowns and even causing other people to catch a virus and be harmed. I mean, what do you think of the messages that we got about the injections? I mean, how wrong were they?
Oh, I mean, I think the messaging is really the entire story. The whole
Mm,
thing is. And so, when we were just talking then about politics not being nuanced, that wasn't always the
mm,
case. If you go back and look at newspaper articles from 100 years ago and Hansard from 100 years ago, there
mm,
was tons of nuance. They were all in the nuance, and they were
mm,
about the details, they were about getting things right. And the
mm,
media would present in a very highbrow way these complicated discussions. But our media have dumbed everything down to so
mm.
much and made everything so emotive. Present company accepted. Um,
Thank you.
that, that then you end up in that trap. And so, if you look at the lot since what's happened since 2020, the beginning of that story was fear propaganda. The fear propaganda existed because the people didn't trust people to make their own judgment about their own level
Mm,
of risk. They thought that they were underestimating their own level of risk. In retrospect, they had it completely right. The fear
mm,
propaganda has caused immense anxiety, disproportionately in younger age groups, which is slightly mind-blowing. But it has had a hugely harmful effect that we're going to reap the effects of for years to come, and it's still very much with us now.
mm,
And then when it came to propagandizing the jabs, it was so incredibly extreme when you look at what we really knew then and what everybody kind of knows now, because it's actually mostly people do kind of get the complexities of it
mm,
now. And you just see the lies that were being told. And, it becomes a lie when you're sort of not being transparent. That's a sort of first red flag. And then when you're, oh gosh, I can't remember what I was about to say. But anyway, there's a series of
mm,
red flags that sort of hint at they're not telling the truth anymore. And those were enough of an indicator for some people, because what I
mm,
find really interesting is that there was a whole swathe of people with no scientific background whatsoever, but they knew that this
mm,
was not right. And so I think that public health officials got this so terribly wrong, thinking that you couldn't say to somebody, there's nuance in this, we don't know all the answers, there's going to be risks as well as benefits, and we don't know what all those risks are. But
mm,
already lying to you about the risk you're at, so the benefits are already exaggerated. How about we don't lie about the risks? But there
mm,
was none. And if you remember, the MHRA were very slow about the clotting problems with AstraZeneca. And the
mm.
Telegraph published on that. They were sort of the first newspaper to do that. They did that quite early on. They then got a phone call from the MHRA saying that if they didn't cease and desist, they wouldn't be invited to any more of their press conferences. So
Wow.
yeah, so I mean that there were so many different aspects of this where there was control of this propagandized narrative, and it's been
Mm.
really hard to tell the truth in that environment.
Well, that is astounding. There's a newspaper who finds something out that is true, presents it to the public, and then they get a call from some government agencies as don't do this, or we're not going to give you any access to us anymore. So they're really impinging on freedom of the press and free speech. I hadn't heard that particular story about the Telegraph, but I mean that's just indicative of how we were controlled and manipulated. Look, Claire, don't go away. We're just going to have a quick news break, and we'll be back in a minute. We'll talk some more. This is today's News Talk TNT. Welcome back to the David Curtin Show here on today's News Talk TNT. And I have with me Claire Craig from Heart, Dr. Claire Craig, who is a hero of the last 4 years, standing up against government misinformation and about the lockdown and injections and everything that's happened. Now, Claire, we were just talking about the manipulation of the media. And there's a story out today, or quite recently, I believe, in the Telegraph that updates something that we hadn't heard before. Can you tell us about that story and what they've actually finally had the courage to say?
Right. So this is the same journalist who was responsible for that phone call to the Telegraph.
Mm,
So she's the health editor, and she has written recently about the APPG, so the All Party Parliamentary Group on Pandemics, which is headed up by Esther McVeigh
mm,
and Graham Stringer. And they've discussed all sorts of aspects of it, but they wrote this really damning piece around the role of the MHRA back in
mm.
October of 2023. And
Right.
the Telegraph have just run with that now. So I think we can still see the effects of that threatening phone call from way back in early 2021 on the
Mm,
reporting of things that are happening now. But what those politicians were saying, they were calling out the fact that the CEO, Dame June Rain of the MHRA, had boasted about her agency becoming an enabler. She said, "We're moving from watchdog to enabler." Like, well, who is it that she wants to enable? Because
mm.
that's not what the public need. The only thing between the pharmaceutical companies and the safety of the public is her agency. And we don't need an enabler in that role. We need a watchdog. That's the purpose of her agency, is to be a watchdog. And these MPs also exposed how much the MHRA knew early on and weren't saying, because, like with the propaganda around the fear, they thought they knew better how
Mm.
risk calculation should be for an individual than that person knew themselves. That sort of immense hubris and arrogance of thinking they knew best, such that
Mm.
they could know that there were clotting problems, but that wasn't for you and I to know.
Wow. I mean, they are supposed to be looking after our health. And so this is why there are safety and procedures in place, and which we've had since the thalidomide disaster. You know, that we all know about that. We all know how many people were appallingly affected by that, and it took years for people to realize. The thing about these injections that we've got is that the safety procedures were just chopped up and thrown away because you're supposed to have 10 years of safety testing. You do phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That takes a number of years to go through all of those phases until something comes to market. But they condensed them all into 3 months and did them simultaneously and then say, oh, we've done the safety testing. Now we can inject them into 50 million people. I mean, that to me is just a very obvious reason why you couldn't trust anything that they were saying.
Yeah,
But
well,
this is even
exactly.
worse. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, what they did is they picked the vaccine kind of pathway through their
Mm.
regulatory rules, which is meant to be for influenza vaccines made using the old-fashioned egg-based methodology, which has, been
Mm.
used for years and years. And you could sort of switch one in, switch one out, and then just sort of fast track because actually you understood that platform really well. Whereas this was a
Mm.
completely novel platform, and they used that track. Like, it was insane to switch to that track. And
Yeah.
furthermore, because they were on that track, there were fundamental questions about the platform that were not asked, and still we don't know about now. So questions
Mm.
like, when you stick this thing into the body that says make spike protein, how much spike protein gets made? For how long? In which parts of the body? How do you get rid of it? Is it the same for everybody? Is it the same for men and
Mm.
women? These are fundamental questions before you give someone a drug that literally we don't know
Mm.
the answer to. And one of the things that was bothering me this week is that it's not just the spike protein that's caused pathology. So the lipid nanoparticles, which were the delivery system that the RNA was
Mm.
got into a cell with, they're toxic, right? Nobody will tell you otherwise. It's a known toxic delivery system.
Wow.
And so, you're taking a risk with them regardless of what you're doing. And they're toxic because they're positively charged. Now, every cell in our body is negatively charged, and RNA and DNA are negatively charged. So if you have foreign DNA or RNA in your body, the cell membrane is going to protect you from it because it's negatively charged, so it will repel
Mm.
it. But they've just put that into a positively charged lipid. And that positively charged
Wow.
lipid is going to get attracted to the cells. There's a whole load of important proteins that sit as like things to help receptors on the surface of the membrane, which will just get blasted away by that arrival of that positive charge. and it will impact, and then it merges with the membrane. So now you've got a cell membrane that's not negatively charged anymore. And what really matters is that's kind of all okay if that cell ends up dead. So if it then delivers the RNA and it makes a foreign protein and the immune system comes along and it kills the cell, it doesn't really matter what other damage you did to that cell. But there's a study going on at McGill University at the moment, which only began in 2023, to figure out how many of the lipid nanoparticles didn't have any mRNA in at all. They don't know. Well, nobody knows.
Right. Wow. I mean, we were told when they were rolled out that the whatever the genetic material, the mRNA, would just stay in your arm. It wouldn't move around the body, and then it would be dispersed, and it would do its job, and then a couple of days it would all go away. But I mean, again, to me that was ridiculous, because how could you know that? I mean, there's been no testing of this. There's been no observation, no empirical observation at all.
Yeah. If that had been true, if it had just stayed in your arm, your immune response to it wouldn't be very good. So actually, if you dig into their own sort of sales pitch to the science community rather than the one they gave to the public, then the methodology was all around how, you've stuck a load of liquid into what's mostly the extracellular space of the muscle, so high pressure, sore arm, and that's going to get drained away either into the venous system or into the lymphatics. And the stuff that goes into the lymphatics gets to the lymph node and educates the cells in the lymph node. And then that's how you develop an immune memory. So it was actually dependent on leaving the arm from the beginning. But the reality is it goes far from the arm. So if it's in the veins, then in the lymphatics, you're immediately affecting the circulatory system. The lymphatics drain, and then all of it drains right up to just close to your heart. And then all of that fluid just gets dumped at a rate of like 4 liters an hour into practically straight into your heart. So, it's pretty much a shortcut from your arm into your heart, and then from there to the lungs, and from there to the rest of your body, and all the while in the vessels. So the cells that are most likely to get exposed, apart from your arm muscle cells, are the ones lining your vessels, the endothelial cells. And of course, that's why we've seen the pathology that we've seen, because those cells have a role to play in every organ. They are in every organ, and they are in particular organs. They create this important barrier. So there's a barrier in the brain, in the ovary, in the testis, and in the placenta, which those cells are responsible for maintaining, which stops pathogens coming in, and it stops, chemical sort of imbalance. But it also protects them from the immune system. And so once you start damaging those cells, you're asking for trouble all over the body.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare. I mean, I thought that from the beginning, but I'm so glad that I didn't take one, to be honest. And I resisted the propaganda, and I know people who have, and nobody I know now who has not taken one of these injections is unhappy. Everybody is happy, and glad that they didn't take one if they didn't take one. But I've heard so many stories about people who have had all kinds of complications, and really their lives have been destroyed by these injections. Do you know anyone personally, or have you heard any stories about people who have been affected by what we call vaccine injuries?
So, I mean, I've met a lot of them because of what I'm doing, so I know a lot of them personally now. And the reality is that their lives have been affected on so many different levels. Obviously their health has been affected, and very often that means their job has been affected, and sometimes that has meant their family life has been affected. And then all of that has happened in an environment where they were pariahs. They weren't allowed to tell their stories, and people hated them for what they represented. And so they had no emotional support from their communities. They've had very little healthcare support from the healthcare system. I mean, honestly, these people have been treated absolutely appallingly, and they have no legal support. You'd think that given all of that, there would be some kind of legal way of tackling it, but actually they can't get legal support either.
This is disturbing, because there is a compensation scheme, but it's very, very hard for people to actually get money from this compensation scheme. And even if you do get any compensation, it's only £120,000 for the rest of your life. You're supposed to survive for the rest of your life with the vaccine injuries with just £120,000, and pay for all your extra health care and extra expenses that you would need for being disabled. And then On top of that, the taxpayers pay. It's you and I who are paying. It's not the vaccine manufacturers who are paying. And I think the whole situation is completely unjust with
It
this
is,
whole
it is.
compensation scheme.
And
Yeah.
yeah, the problem with that scheme is that it wasn't looked at for a long, long time. We hadn't had a problem
Yeah.
with vaccine damage, so that number is historic and hadn't been
Yeah.
brought up to date. And then on top of that, the purpose of that vaccine damage payment was to give people something to live off while they were getting ready to sue the companies, and also
Mm.
potentially something to help them do the suing with. But the idea was it was a stopgap to help them sue the companies. But the legislation at the moment is, well, you kind of theoretically can sue them, although you can't really get legal support very
Mm.
easily. And that if you do sue them, the companies have indemnity, which means that, again, it's you and I that would foot the bill. But actually, to be honest, I'm
Yeah.
happy to foot. And the politicians can change that situation. They are in a position where
Right.
they can say, like, this is unjust, actually.
Well, I certainly would if I got into a position of power. Obviously, trying to do that, if we can do with the Heritage Party, and we would bring justice to these people, and we would put the manufacturers on the hook for the damage that they've done, because they must have done this in full knowledge of the results that they got with internal testing, showing. I think Pfizer had 9 pages of side effects in their report that they showed, and so people would have known about this, but we were kept in the dark for in many ways. So look, Claire, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I wish we could talk more, because there's so much to talk about, and you have a fantastic knowledge of the science, and you explain it very well to our viewers. So thanks for coming and joining me on the show, Claire. Welcome back to the David Curtin Show here on today's News Talk TNT. Now, Dr. Claire Craig from Heart is still with me. We've been having a really good conversation about the appalling way that people have been treated during lockdowns and injections, and all of the psychological manipulation that's been done by the government, by pharmaceutical companies, by behavioral psychology units, and so on. Claire, welcome back to the show. I'd like to ask you at the moment, thank you. I'd like to ask you at the moment, there's now a COVID inquiry going on, and but it doesn't look like it's actually asking any decent questions that are going to get to the heart of the matter. I mean, and the evidence that people are giving, the answers that people are giving to the questions, seems to be of the nature of, oh, if it happened again, we should lock down harder and faster and sooner. I mean, there's no sort of recognition that lockdowns were wrong, and in trying to inject everybody was wrong. It's going the other way than what I think it should do. Have you been taking note of the COVID inquiry that's going on, and if so, what kind of questions do you think they should be asking of the people who were involved?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I have so many questions that I would be asking myself. So many questions. And I'm not familiar with the law behind how public inquiries are set up, but
Mm.
I've tried to figure it out. And they have this idea that you can be a core participant. And as a core participant, you actually get represented by a barrister, and you can be putting questions to the witnesses. And so when you look at who they've invited to be core participants, it tells you all you need to know, because we've applied to be core participants and we've been rejected. And you're like, well, actually, we could be putting some really interesting questions to those witnesses. But the people who are our core participants are people like Neil Ferguson, who then I get to put a witness statement in, and he gets to cross-examine me on my witness statement, but nobody proper cross-examines him on his. It's all completely topsy-turvy. And the whole thing was summarized really when oh goodness, her name just escaped me, Hallett. Dame Hallett said, well, I'll tell you what she's talking about later, but she just said, well, if there is no evidence of harm, then there must surely be a benefit. Or so, I can't remember exactly the wording she said, but she was basically saying, well, if the harm isn't really an issue, then we, of course, we would do it regardless. And she was talking about masking, but that approach seems to be something you could sort of extrapolate to the whole thing, that their way of thinking is we must do everything just in case. And of course, doing stuff is what causes the harm. That's this, and we've always known that. We have this idea of the precautionary principle that you don't go charging in doing stuff. You always wait and make sure and test, and just be really, really careful, because everything you do will
Mm.
cause unexpected harm in some way or another. That's just the nature of complex systems that we live in.
Yeah. But one of the things they could have done is prescribe known antivirals like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which have known and have been known over many decades to, have a general antiviral effect. But those things were banned in a way. They disappeared off the shelves. You couldn't get them.
And
I mean,
the
what do
whole
you think
approach
about those?
the whole approach was really utterly illogical. I mean, it wasn't
Mm,
logic that was driving it. We know that, but
mm,
so with the vaccines, you're going to go and do an intervention with healthy people. You need to be very, very, very careful about
mm,
doing something to healthy people. But if you take people who are sick with COVID, all people with comorbidities in hospital with COVID, and any one of them does have actually a fair, their odds aren't, they've got a chance of dying, right? It's not like it wasn't
mm.
as presented. They're more likely to survive pretty much at any age than die. But nevertheless, there's a chance they're going to die. Somebody with a chance of dying, then you try out these drugs that are otherwise safe because
Mm.
actually the upside is going to be better than the downside because you know that they're basically safe. It's unlikely they're unsafe in this scenario. They might
Mm.
be, but it's unlikely. And there's a likely benefit. And so the way that those simple, cheap treatments were dealt with tells its own whole story about the
Mm.
approach to this because it was utterly immoral how that happened and how the
Yeah.
people who were advocating for those drugs were treated as well. Really awful. And so
Mm.
when you look at it through that one lens, you see the whole thing through a very different light because it made no sense doing like that. It was
Yeah.
inverting ethical principles to not give people a chance to live when they're dying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I used my voice in whatever way I could to advocate for those things and to speak against lockdowns, to speak against coerced and mandatory vaccinations. But I was banned numerous times off social media platforms for doing so, and essentially shut up and censored. That's how we were treated. And there were calls actually at some point. I remember sitting in the London Assembly, and there was one time Nadeem Zahawi came to speak to us. And they didn't even want to let me ask a question. I had to interrupt at the very end, which is quite embarrassing. And I asked him a question about these injections and saying, well, there's been some severe adverse health effects in Norway. And this was very early on in when they'd administered there. And then the reaction from the other assembly members was like, they did, one of them did this like to the chairman, another one was waving their arms around. The chairman cut me off and stopped me from speaking, and then later on in the meeting someone asked, shouldn't we put people in prison who are spreading misinformation? I mean, this was from an elected assembly member who normally is very friendly to me. So the response was absolutely deranged in a way.
So I think the way to understand that response, the only way I can really
Mm,
understand that response, and obviously
mm,
that's only one example of many of
mm,
that sort of
mm,
approach, is that the vaccines were being treated as if they were holy. And I know that
mm.
sounds slightly bonkers, but actually
Well,
everything starts to make sense when you see it like that, that, people like us, we were blasphemers, we get excommunicated. And then people who are the vaccine injured, they're the apostates because they're showing up the whole religion. And so they're even worse
mm,
than blasphemers. And it does actually start to make sense when you see it through a religious lens that people, this was a sacred cow, and
mm.
people were worshipping a golden calf, whichever way you want to put it. And what happens when you do that is it all goes to shit, and that's exactly what's happened.
Mm. It's a false god and a false religion, isn't it? But that's a really good way of looking at it because they did bring out almost new rituals, didn't they? When the first happened, you went out at 8 o'clock on a Thursday and clapped for the NHS, which is like, that's what I thought. This is like this. It's like a new religion.
Yeah, and I think some
Unbelievable.
of that, like if you were deliberately trying to bring in a new religion, you would do a lot of the things that were done.
Mm,
So things like, cults start off in a climate of fear. That's how you do it. You get
mm,
people scared, and then they follow their fear inside their gut instead of following their
mm.
natural gut instincts. And that's how you manipulate people, and that's how you manipulate a population, and that's what was done.
Indeed, indeed. So Heart has been amazing, over the whole time. But what about now? What is your focus now? Because, we've kind of come out of lockdowns. There's been 2 years. People aren't getting COVID boosters much anymore. I think even people that were, taken in by that in 2021, 2022 have now given up on that. But what do you see, what are you doing now? Where's your action of focus and fight these days?
So that's so there's multifaceted still, and we're really
Mm.
busy still. So on the one
Yeah.
hand, we're publishing our weekly bulletins because actually the story really hasn't stopped. There's stuff coming out
Mm.
every single week, more and more truths to be revealed. And so we're still publishing on that on a weekly basis.
Mm.
I'm trying to write the whole thing up. I still haven't finished. I promised a second
Mm.
book about the vaccines, which is nearly there. So that's keeping me busy.
Mm.
But looking to the future, what we're trying to do is figure out a way of getting justice for the people who've been injured, because that's
Mm.
critical to the whole thing, and it's critical to ensuring that it doesn't get swept on a rug and then repeated in the future. And I think actually that's something that we will still be writing a lot about, is the
Mm.
pandemic preparedness industry, which was responsible for really all that happened. And there's a lot of people who are still bigging that up as being really important, including people who are vaccine skeptics, who still, as part of their vaccine skepticism, they still think there was this terrible
Mm.
virus out there that we had to do something about. And so it's interesting actually, depending on what point in the timeline people kind of woke up, a lot of them don't look at what went on before that point, and they just sort of are
Mm.
looking forward. And so there's still an awful lot of education that needs to be done. And
Mm.
I think we have to just keep doing that. I know that for some people they'll think it's boring and old, but I'm not bored of it by any means. I think it's really
Mm.
important still.
Well, I think we're in a lull because it's a long lull, but behind the scenes, you've got the World Health Organization trying to bring in this new pandemic preparedness treaty or change the international health regulations 2005. I never heard of them until the whole lockdown period happened. But what they're trying to do is beef them up so that they will have control over government's health policies if they declare a global emergency. I mean, how will that happen? If that happens, do you think, how will that affect our nations if that does happen, do you think?
So that is absolutely what they're trying to do. And my lawyer friends tell me quite convincingly that the reason the legal profession aren't up in arms about this is because for them, international law is just sort of fluff. You ignore it. We're sovereign. We do
Mm.
our own laws.
Mm.
But I'm just not completely convinced by that, because I think any politician or movement that can point to the WHO and say they want this and it's in their regulations, that's
Mm.
incredibly powerful when you're saying that to the public. It's really powerful. And if you say, well, our government's not doing that and it's against WHO regulations, then that disempowers the government who are trying to do the right thing by the people. So even if it's not legally enforceable, it's an incredibly powerful thing that they're trying to do. And what's really tricky, of course, is that WHO's image in most people's minds, as it was in mine for most of my life, is
Mm.
really benign, super benign. They go and
Mm.
they help people get clean water, they help the health of children in Africa, all these great causes. And actually, what they've become is far from benign. They really are a malign institution, hidden in sheep's clothing, and they're led by a malign man as well, who's he's got a
Mm.
he's got a history that you wouldn't expect. For a start, he's not a doctor, but
Right.
his history in politics and what he's done in his life is not pretty.
Yeah, Tedros, isn't it? The whole world seems to be led, or the policies of the whole world is being led by these people who are not health experts. You got him, Tedros. You've got Bill Gates. Obviously, we've got in America. You've got Dr. Fauci, who's a doctor of some kind. But I wouldn't trust him with my life. It's absolutely appalling. We're totally against this World Health Organization pandemic preparedness treaty. I think this would And yeah, as you said, Claire, the governments would implement it, and then if you had a government that was sympathetic to the WHO and imposing more restrictions and more tyranny, they would say, okay, we're in it, we're going to do this, and therefore that would give them an excuse to impose more regulations and more lockdowns. We need to avoid that. Anyway, Claire, thank you so much for coming on to the show with me and staying for a long time, 40 minutes. It's been really great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, David. All right.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. And I will see you again, our viewers, next week here on The David Kurten Show and on TNT, Today's News Talk. Have a great weekend.